The views expressed in this review are my own. I encourage everyone to pick up a copy of the book and read it for themselves. What I like, others may not, and vice versa. If you would like to read or critique my own work, I will leave a link in the description. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. I've spent a lot of time thinking about how I want to do this review because Dune is something special. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying it's great, or even good. I'm saying it's special. I'm not going to beat around the bush with this one. I'm going to dive right in. I'm going to cover the first 3 books in the first novel as quickly as I can. I do not apologize for spoilers because this book is around 80 years old. A movie has been made of it, and a remake series has been made of the movie. You're probably already familiar with the story through osmosis anyway. Without further ado, Paul Atreides is the son of a minor planetary governor. If that sentence sounds ridiculous to you, it may be because you, like I, have a hard time calling the ruler of an entire planet a minor anything. Paul's father, Leto I, has received a great opportunity. He gets to move his whole family from his lush backwater world with food, oceans, and reasonable temperatures to the most desert planet to ever exist, Dune. I'm not kidding, it's so dry you have to irrigate a cactus if you wanted it to survive. Dune sports other such amenities as hostile natives, giant omnivorous sandworms, and an obvious trap set by the monstrously fat former governor who is mad at losing his planet to the royal equivalent of a hillbilly. Dune, whose proper name is Arceus, which I won't be using again, does have one major selling point. It's the only place in the universe where spice is mined. What is spice? Well, it's like if an opiate had a baby with another narcotic, and then that baby went on to have another baby with a mental steroid. The result is a drug that actually does give you mental powers, or at least gives them to some people. It's used all over the Empire by the Spacers Guild, the Mentats, basically human computers, and all sorts of obscenely wealthy people. Leto moves his family to the most defensible city on the planet, and begins his mining operations with the blown-out equipment left behind by the former governor. He also goes about changing the obscenely decadent customs the Baron who once ruled the planet put there. Very soon after, the Baron's plans go off. Paul and his mother Jessica are taken to the desert to be killed, Leto is brought before the governor to brag, and it was their family doctor who betrayed them. This series of problems are solved almost immediately, like this. Paul and Jessica kill their captors and get away. Leto uses a special suicide tooth that kills the governor's assassin, but doesn't kill the governor. And it turns out that while the doctor may have betrayed the family, he made arrangements for the rest of Leto's family to be safe, as long as Leto used the suicide tooth to kill the Baron. This was all for killing the doctor's wife. Oh, and constant exposure to spice has combined with all the training his parents put him through to give Paul special powers to see into the future, past, and truth. Moving on to the second book. Paul and Jessica are stuck in the desert. They are attacked by a sandworm, then run into the Fremen, the hostile natives that were mentioned earlier. They are interested in taking Paul, but not his mother, an attractive woman still in childbearing years. Jessica demonstrates that she can kill them all with Witch Fu, the name I'm going to give the combat style of the order of eugenicists she comes from. The Fremen agree that she is useful now and take her along with them. They were picked up by the Chief, who volunteers so much backstory we're not gonna cover it here. Paul meets Desert Girl, who he's seen in his prophetic dreams he's had since the beginning of the book, and falls in love. One chatter dump later, and they're doing what teenagers do if you turn your back on them for 10 minutes. Paul's mom becomes the Reverend Mother of the Fremen, but doesn't tell them she's pregnant beforehand. After drinking the heavily drugged water that's required for the ritual and going on a trip with an old woman, Jessica now has all the memories that were passed down by the Fremen, and there will be nebulous consequences for the baby. Third book. A few years have passed and Paul is now running a terror campaign against the Baron who killed his dad. He's gone full native, wearing the suit that collects body water, riding the sandworms, and blowing up government property. Without getting too far into the weeds, Paul starts connecting with the people who are left from his father's court. They're all startled at how native Paul is gone, and the fact that he's alive, but they fall in line anyway. Paul gathers all his allies just in time for the Emperor to surround the planet with a fleet of hostile allies. Paul comes up with a way to kill all animal life on Dune, which would effectively destroy the spice and the economy, and then confronts the Emperor. Paul forces the Emperor to surrender his throne, fights with someone who was almost what he is, brings every group to heel under the threat of eliminating the only source of spice they've found, and then he takes the Emperor's daughter as a wife. This is the same daughter whose entries we've been reading at the start of each chapter to cement his throne. He then promises to never sleep with the princess because he loves his wife, who is actually his concubine. This is despite his wife being from a polygamous society. That covers the first 3 books in the Dune series that came in the first novel, and I wanted to be really brief, and I'm going to tell you why. I'm going to do something unusual and cover my thoughts first. There's a lot I'd like to talk about before we get into my own personal taste, though I can't promise this won't be flavored with my own personal taste. First of all, I think I've hit story bedrock with this series. If not bedrock, then a non-permeable layer. I had some trouble getting into the story because as I read, I kept thinking, I've read this before. Wait a minute, I know this structure. Oh, now I see where that comes from. I'm well aware of the comparisons made between Dune and Warhammer 40k. That's not what I'm talking about here. The young man protagonist, one or both parents killed, destined for greatness, awakens to power, fights corrupt power structures using natives he's become part of, falls in love with native girl, who's the best of her people. I feel like I've read this book at least 3 times last year. I'm sure Dune is not the first book with this plot, but it is the oldest book I've read that has it. I wasn't aware this plot was that old. In a lot of ways, it kept me from giving the book a fair shake, because each new turn I've seen somewhere else before. There are other things that felt all too familiar. In the book, it turns out that Paul is the mixing of 2 warring families of the story, the Atreides and the Harkonnens. His mother, it turns out, is the daughter of the man who orchestrated his father's death. His mother doesn't know this at first. It's a secret kept by the Bene Gesserit, the eugenicist cult she belongs to. I want to say this felt Shakespearean, but I honestly can't remember if that's the oldest place I've seen this secret relatives theme. I wasn't a big fan of this reveal because I don't think Baron Harkonnen would care unless it was a threat to his power, which it honestly wasn't. He should kind of already know about it. Some may disagree, but the Baron has constantly demonstrated in the books that he 1. Likes men, 2. Likes young men, and 3. Allowed himself to be seduced by a Bene Gesserit. The Bene Gesserit don't seem to make a secret of their membership to their cult, or at least I haven't seen them do so in the book. The galaxy knows who the Bene Gesserit are, and what they do. One does not leave one's preference without a clear understanding of why. The Baron would suspect that he has a daughter out there somewhere because the Bene Gesserit birth almost exclusively girls. Somehow. Speaking of the Baron, I get the feeling he's supposed to be portrayed as evil. I can see it, I understand it, but I don't feel it. Maybe it's because of the time we're in, which isn't a fault of the book or the author. But the Baron isn't doing anything I haven't seen from real-world politicians. He's a fat, corrupt, murderous pedo who has his enemies killed for profit and politics. Oh no, I best not throw an apple in DC, it might bounce off of one of those and hit 2 others. The Baron is at least competent. His plans, though undoubtedly evil, work. He's not some hedonist too absorbed with his own pleasures to run what he's in charge of. He's a hedonist who does his job and then is an appalling monster in his free time. All I'm saying is it's hard to get me worked up over a villain who isn't as bad as their real-world counterparts. Moving on. I'm in the middle of the 4th book, and I can already see this story becoming a confusing mess. Paul is already struggling with not sleeping with his war bride. Her position, birthrights, and acquisitions aside, there is a particular cruelty in forcibly marrying someone and forcing them to be childless. That being said, I'm watching as groups are trying to murder Paul. The guy, I remind you, is able to see into the future and past, and whose people literally hold the whole civilization hostage. It feels like the story may devolve into a nonsensical soup of irrational motives, but I'm speculating on an unfinished book, and I should get back to what I've actually read. Let's talk themes, because this book has some wild ones, or at least wild by today's standards. First off, eugenics, because I'd hate to have this video monetized. Paul is the result of a massive breeding program created and managed by the Bene Gesserit cult. The book doesn't call them a cult, but I do. Outside of their weird breeding practices, they're about the best female education system I've ever seen. They teach their members basically every language in existence, fighting techniques, history, manipulation, botany, things that are practically magic, and a bunch of other things I'm sure will come up as the story needs them. So why do I call them a cult? Well, they keep an iron grasp on their members through propaganda and trauma. They have literally brainwashed the populations of planets in case they may need them in the future. And lastly, their members breed solely for the benefit of their order and ideals. That being said, I don't want this to become a commentary on theology. The entire point of the Bene Gesserit breeding program is to make a male that can do the near mystical things they can do, but more. Then they want to control him for their purposes. I'm not sure who okayed this program. It's like making an AI that's more competent and capable than any individual or organization. Then you give it the ability to see the future and past with perfect clarity. Then you try to manipulate it for your own gain. The thing will not only know what you're doing, but where it will lead and what it can do to fool you because it's basically all-knowing. The concept of manipulating an all-knowing being aside, I'm not going to argue on the merits and problems with eugenics because I like having a YouTube channel and I don't want to turn the comments off on this video for all the weirdos that may come to comment. Let's talk about destiny. I'm not talking about a stripper. Destiny plays a big role in Dune. Paul is destined to become who he is, the Fremen are destined to go on their jihad in his name, and the idea of prescience, the ability to see all possible futures that Paul has, can only exist if destiny is a thing. I personally don't like destiny, it's like lazy foreshadowing. There's no other reason for it to exist than the author says so. That being said, it can be done right, like when it's actually woven into the plot, and it feels more like you're watching a series of gears in a clock run than a bunch of random events just happening to occur, ending at a point that was formally designated. In Dune, destiny feels more like it happens because the author said so. After Paul develops his ability, every decision he makes is based on the outcomes he sees with his power. This almost entirely removes his agency. Now it's no longer a story about a young man trying to achieve a goal. It's become connect the dots. All stakes are removed because we already know the main character has the answers and knows what he has to do to achieve what he wants to get. It's like playing a game with a game guide. The idea of prescience could be a good one if it's tempered. With the exception of the fourth book where Paul can't use it anymore, once he awakens his power, it feels more like a passive ability than something he has to activate. It's right there whenever he needs it, and so all risk and danger are drained from the story. Another thing that tells me how old this book is male versus female roles. The Bene Gesserit are a cult of women. They maximize their feminine wiles in order to manipulate powerful men into doing what they want. Yes, they are trained in many forms of combat, but more than anything else they are trained in manipulating men through marriage, companionship, and physical pleasure. This is not something you'll see in stories today. Maybe in Japan or adult entertainment, but certainly not a AAA franchise. All that said, the Bene Gesserit are looking for a male that can do what they cannot. The Reverend Mothers have the ability to see into the past and divine truth. They cannot look into the future. That is the crux of their breeding program. It's the whole reason for Paul's existence. But let's talk a little bit about the battle lady trope we see here. The Bene Gesserit are trained in combat. They're so proficient in hand-to-hand that, like many of the other things they do, it's considered witchcraft. Jessica herself takes on a few grown men, and not in the way that facilitates soft jazz, bad acting, and fuzzy camera filters, though there was a threat of that at one point. I personally don't mind the battle lady trope. Hell, I've used it myself. It's a weakness in men to have women interested in the things we like. With the Bene Gesserit, though, it feels a bit much. They're already schooled in every language, taught the art of manipulating everyone and everything, learned commerce, finance, decoration, genealogy, and on and on and on. It's one thing to know a little bit about all subjects, but to be a master of everything under the sun is impossible. There is a lot you can instill in a person if you start early, and yes, they can be insanely competent. What we have here is bordering on Mary Sue. Jessica, like her son, can pull any answer she needs out of her Bene Gesserit training regardless of the task. Paul has the excuse of prescience as to why most of what he does works out. It makes sense why people of this universe call the Bene Gesserit witches, because magic is the best reason I can think of as to how they're this competent. Let's talk about mixing mental powers and space travel, because I like this theme. But there are a few ways to approach it. In Warhammer 40k, it's literal psychic powers. In Dune, it's super computational ability, brought on by performance-enhancing drugs. Personally, I really like this theme because it makes a more nebulous barrier to space travel than, we need some rare element, we can't actually go faster than light, or we have to fold reality. We accept that the technology already exists and we move on. The biggest problem is navigation, and we need super special humans to do it. That being said, we're starting to drift back into the area of eugenics, and so I'll move on. We aren't told much about the Spacing Guild. They're highly secretive and jealously guard access to space travel. All we know is they require spice to do what they do, and they have a monopoly on space travel. I would like more exploration into who they are and what they do. I assume we get more in later books, which I'm not sure I'll be reading. The last theme I want to discuss is humanity over machines. Since we started making machines complicated enough that most people couldn't tell how they worked, there's been a running gag about the rise of machines. Dune hits this theme pretty hard. It's why the universe has Mentats and the Spacers Guild. At some point in their past, people with thinking machines used them to enslave people without them. Then the people with better thinking machines used them to enslave the original people with thinking machines. I think it was also implied at some point the machines just took over. At least until the humans declared a jihad and destroyed the thinking machines. We don't get too many details on what happened and how we won. What we are given is the 11th commandment. Thou shalt not make a machine in the likeness of a man's mind. Parallels to our current world aside, I like the man versus machine angle. That in ridding itself of the thinking machine, man forced himself to evolve. I think the concept that you could train a human mind to calculate faster than even a modern computer is absolutely ludicrous. But having people work as computers is not as ludicrous as it might seem. Most people have a horrible impression of math. They were traumatized by public schools, bad teachers, and Hollywood's contempt for people who actually know how to do things. Math is amazingly procedural. After spending 3 years drowning in it, I can confidently say it's simpler than many other skills. It has set concrete rules. All you're learning is when and where to apply them. In this sense, it's a lot more brute force than what you see required in other skills. I don't want to make this rant about math. So do I think humans could outcomputate machines? No. Could we do math well enough to facilitate intergalactic travel? Maybe. I still wouldn't want to take the risk. So now that I've ranted on about my thoughts, let's talk about what I like. I feel like I'm mentioning this a lot lately, and the more I read, the more important it becomes. The books are well written. I can't give it too many points for this because it was published in a time where you had to be. As I'm reading, I know where I am and what's going on. I know who's talking and why. The prose were clean and enjoyable. That being said, let's talk about the atmosphere. The author did a fantastic job in this respect. Dune feels dry, dusty, and very uncomfortable. We get details with little things like the still suits and how people who wear them get little indents in their nose from the hose, the way it shifts when they wear them, the stale taste of the water it makes. These and many more little details help paint a vivid picture of Dune as a horribly dry place. I mentioned earlier that Dune was so dry you'd have to irrigate a cactus. That wasn't hyperbole. Jessica finds the Emperor's secret plant laboratory in their manor when they first come to Dune. This is where this point is first brought up. This is further emphasized by the people in their city staring longingly at a date palm and being jealous of the water required to keep them alive. The water and the struggle are a constant thing, and it creates a wonderfully thick atmosphere. I bring this up because atmosphere can be hard. There's a fine line between building it effectively and overwhelming your reader with constant reminders that it's hot and dry. The book does remind us of the planet's lack of water, but rarely the same way twice. It's in the longing stares of the peasants at the date palm, in the ritual of the upper class splashing water onto the floor to be sopped up with towels and begged for by the lower classes. The use of water as a reverent substance in speech and trade. It does get a little much at times, like when two characters are having a conversation and the whole thing pivots on whether it's a water matter or not. I did get tired of the word water after a while. So let's get into some world building. Yes, Dune has good world building. Is it the best I've seen? No. Is it good? Yes. The political situation leading to Paul's family is a horrid little sandball. The political situation leading Paul's family to this horrid little sandball is complex. A bit overly so. For the most part, it's understandable. Leto has to take the planet because of the opportunity it provides. He's effectively being handed a monopoly on the product that runs the empire. It would be like if oil only was available in one country and you were given the chance to run that country and be the sole provider of energy to the entire world. If you can't become obscenely wealthy from that, you are actively trying not to. Yes, Dune is a trap, but the reward is so great and the punishment for not taking it is greater still. That being said, I have trouble believing that the Emperor would take such an immense risk. I'm not saying our elites wouldn't take such a stupid risk with our safety, prosperity, and productivity, but this does seem a bit extreme. While I'm not familiar with the finer domestic policies at the time this book was written, it's nice to read a story pretty much free of real-world politics. Yes, there are heavily religious tones from our own world in this book. Mostly, the politics are in-world. It's a struggle between the powerful of this universe. It's not a commentary on how bad Group A is for this, that, and the other thing. A brief aside. The reason in-world politics is fine and real-world politics is not in a story is simple. The level of detachment. With in-world politics, the strife ends when you set the book down. It's fun to discuss because it's hypothetical and a new chain of logic to be followed and study at your leisure. Real-world politics are in your face all the time. They involve a lot more screaming and annoying people. For me, real-world politics is what I'm trying to escape by reading. To have them injected into a story is like being nagged to mow the yard after getting home from a 16-hour workday. The only people who are going to like it are those with a fetish for it, and the same can be said of conspiracies. A note, I'm using conspiracies in its technical definition, not in its political definition. It can be fun to watch characters conspire against each other because of the level of detachment. Referencing real-world conspiracies or using a story to berate the possibility of real-world conspiracies and conspiracy theories is equally tedious as injecting real-world politics. It's like horror. It can be fun to read, it can be fun to play horror games, but you don't want to experience the terrible things that are happening in these in real life. Back to the book. I did enjoy the actual conspiracies in the book, but to a large degree they really didn't mesh well. There are long scenes of the Baron laying out his plans to his nephew and Mentat assassin. While they were executed, we don't get to see the parts where the Baron's conspiracies play out. The Mentat assassin laid the groundwork, yes. The problem is, he does little outside of that. It's unnecessary for him to be an assassin because we don't see him do any assassinating. The Baron isn't the only one with conspiracies. Leto has his, and to an extent the Fremen have theirs. Some of them are pretty fun, if not overcomplicated. That being said, they could have been presented better. The conspiracies are revealed mostly through exposition, then 5 minutes of action by underlings. You aren't given a trail to follow, and you don't really get to watch the plans unfolding. Conspiracies are best in a long game. You want to watch them laid out and how they work and can go wrong. Sadly, while I enjoyed the conspiracies in Dune, they fall short. There is one theme I really like in this book, and it's one most of us should be familiar with. Hardship, breeding, strength. The Fremen are strong because of the obstacles they must overcome. The Sardaukar, the Emperor's private army, are strong because of the Hellworld prison planet they come from. At the end of the third book, Paul neuters the Emperor's power by converting his prison world into a garden world, ensuring the Sardaukar will be weakened with the removal of their hardships. I like this theme because it works really well in literature, even if the real-world results are mixed. There's a Russian saying that goes, "The same water that hardens the egg softens the potato." Some people prosper in hardships, and others wilt in them. We all know people who simply hit life harder than most people, and we all know people who rise to the occasion. That being said, outside of exposition regarding the hardships of the Fremen, when we reach them, I was a little let down. Yes, their lives are undoubtedly hard, but I'm not as convinced as I should be. We see a lot of it through Paul's eyes, and he's destined to know their ways from the onset. It makes it really hard to experience hardship when you're viewing it through the lens of someone destined for greatness, especially when they know little failure. This is a good segue into my dislikes. Paul is pretty weak as far as characters go. I don't mean physical strength or capabilities. I don't dislike him because I can't. He's a puppet. Unless you have a phobia, it's hard to fear something with no agency. Paul is following where destiny leads him. Even when he doesn't like where it's going, he's brought by degrees to accept it. Even before he develops his powers, Paul is bordering on a Mary Sue. He meets and exceeds every challenge. People are quick to congratulate him for every minor accomplishment. He picks up on things too quickly. Granted, most of them aren't hard. Many of my first complaints could be answered with, he's a noble son, and so of course everybody's going to be nice to him, and of course he's going to get the best training that's available. But I'm not seeing any flaws outside of being naive, and that's remedied by the end of the first book when he's given his ability to see into the future and the past. I like to watch characters grow, to change, and to have to deal with their failures. Paul is too good most of the time, and at others, he's too wooden. Paul's father, Leto, is a more interesting character. He's willing to walk into an obvious trap to better his family's position. His arrangement with Paul's mother is complicated at the best of times. He can't marry her for political reasons, but he won't take a wife because of his affection for Jessica. While Paul inherited his regal looks from his mother, it's a shame he didn't inherit any character from his father. That being said, Leto is a bit too sentimental, and people fall to him almost as quickly as his son. We have a similar problem with the Baron's plan. It goes off without a hitch. Paul does survive an assassination attempt, but it didn't feel threatening. Then, when the time is right, the coup just happens with what feels like no resistance. Everyone who needs to be captured is captured, and then plot happens. In a lot of ways, it felt more like reading a summary of events with some embellishments than a story with actual struggles. It would have been nice to see a splash of the behind-the-scenes stuff, the positioning of forces, the paying of bribes, some setup that would have given a sense of danger and expectation. Stuff happens, answers appear, and no real growth occurs. The same is true with Paul gaining the trust of the natives far too quickly. They're ready to bring him in the second they meet him. They trust him with things that hostile natives certainly wouldn't trust outsiders with. I'm also not seeing the level of greed which is common in environments of scarcity. The chief they meet is ready to let Jessica, an attractive woman in childbearing years, die in the desert after taking her son. Then, when they take her in, he doesn't want to marry her because it may seem greedy because he already has a bunch of wives. They let Paul pick up their most attractive single woman with little to no resistance. I'm sorry, I was led to believe these were dangerous people who killed outsiders. What I'm presented with are sand Mormons who are trying to bring in anyone who's halfway respectful to their society. All of their daring and violence on the battlefield, and the final battle itself, all happen off-screen. That is until Paul burst into the Emperor's meeting on the back of a giant sandworm. This video is already going on for a touch too long, so I'm going to move on to my conclusion. I have really mixed feelings about this series. There are elements of a great story here, but it's missing a lot of pieces. This story needs a lot more show, a bit more fail, and a lot more pain. I like the universe, there's a lot of potential here, but I'm not sure how this is a classic unless it started a lot of the trends I was mentioning earlier. There's certainly a dash of modern in this story, and standing beside some of the modern books that have come from it, it feels a bit lacking. While it lacks the excitement of some of its descendants, there are things it does well. Sadly, most of them are world building, and as we all know, 800 pages of world building does not a story make. Good luck, everyone.